Everybody, it's Mrs. Ragazzino and I teach fourth grade. I'm going to be reading Chapter 19, Admiral Drake from Mr. Popper's Penguins. Enjoy. Chapter 19, Admiral Drake. So Mr. Popper, with Captain Cook, Greta, Columbus, Louisa, Nelson, Jenny, Magellan, Adelina, Scott, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria, was bundled into the patrol wagon and hustled off to the police station. None of his pleas could move the desk sergeant. The theater manager is pretty mad at the way you busted into his theater, so I'm holding you. I'm going to give you all a nice quiet cell, unless you furnish bail. I'm putting the bail at $500 for you and $100 for each of the birds. Of course, Mr. Popper did not have that much money about him. Neither did Mrs. Popper when they telephoned her at the hotel. The hotel bill was paid for several days ahead, but she had no cash. The check for the final week's salary was not due until the end of the week. Indeed, it now looked as if the Poppers would never see that check, since they could not get the Penguins out of jail long enough to put on their act at the Royal Theatre. If only they could have got in touch with Mr. Greenbaum, Mr. Popper knew that kind man would have got them out. But Mr. Greenbaum was somewhere in Hollywood, out on a Pacific coast, and the Poppers had no idea how to reach him. It was very dull for the birds in jail. Wednesday came, and there was still no word from Mr. Greenbaum. Thursday, and the birds began to droop. It was soon apparent that the lack of exercise, combined with the heat, might prove too much for them. There were no more tricks or merry games. Even the younger birds sat all day in dismal silence, and Mr. Popper could not cheer them up. Mr. Popper had a feeling that Mr. Greenbaum would probably turn up by the end of the week to see about renewing the contract, but Friday passed without any news of him. Saturday morning, Mr. Popper got up very early and smoothed his hair. Then he dusted off the Penguins as well as he could, for he wanted everything to look as presentable as possible in case Mr. Greenbaum should appear. About 10 o'clock, there was a sound of footsteps in the corridor and a jingling of keys, and the door of the cell was opened. "You're free, Mr. Popper. There's a friend of yours here." Mr. Popper stepped out into the light with the Penguins. "You're barely in time, Mr. Greenbaum," he was about to say. Then, as his eyes became accustomed to the light, he looked again. It was not Mr. Greenbaum who stood there. It was a great, bearded man in a splendid uniform. Smiling, he held out his hand to Mr. Popper. "Mr. Popper," he said, "I am Admiral Drake." "Admiral Drake?" gasped Mr. Popper. "Not back from the South Pole?" "Yes," said Admiral Drake. "The Drake Antarctic Expedition ship returned yesterday. You should have seen the reception New York gave us. You can read about it in today's paper, but I read about the trouble you were having over the Penguins, and so here I am. I have a long story to tell you." "Could we go to the hotel and talk about it?" asked Mr. Popper. "My wife will be anxious to see us back." "Certainly," said the Admiral. And when they were all settled in the Popper rooms at the hotel with the Penguins clustering around to listen, Admiral Drake began. "Naturally, when I knew that I was coming back to America, I often thought about the man to whom I had sent the Penguin. It takes us a long time to hear things down there, and I often wondered how you and the bird were getting along. Last night, at the mayor's dinner for us, I heard about the wonderful trained penguin act you had been putting on all over the country. This morning, I picked up the paper, and the first thing I read was that Mr. Popper and his 12 penguins were still being held in jail. But 12 penguins, Mr. Popper, how on earth?" Then Mr. Popper told how Greta had arrived to keep Captain Cook from being lonely, and how the little penguins had grown, and how the clever little band had saved the day for the Poppers when things looked bad. "It's amazing," said Admiral Drake. "I've seen a lot of penguins in my time, but never such educated ones as these. It certainly shows what patience and training can do. But now, to get to my real point, Mr. Popper, you probably know that I have explored the North Pole as well as the South Pole." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Popper respectfully. "I have read books about both your Arctic and your Antarctic expeditions." "Well then," said the Admiral, "maybe you know why we explorers prefer the South Pole." "Could it be on account of the penguins, sir?" asked Janie, who had been listening very hard. Admiral Drake patted her head. "Yes, my dear. Those long polar nights get pretty dull when you have no pets to play with. Of course, there are polar bears up there, but you can't play with them. Nobody knows why there are no penguins at the North Pole. For a long time, the United States government has been wanting me to lead an expedition up there for the purpose of establishing a breed of penguins. I must come to the point, Mr. Popper. You've had such a remarkable success with these birds of yours. Why not let me take them to the North Pole and start a race of penguins there? Just then, Mr. Greenbaum and another gentleman were announced. They shook hands all around and were introduced to the Admiral. Well, Popper, said Mr. Greenbaum, too bad about that mix-up over the theaters. But never mind. Here's Mr. Klein, who owns the colossal film company. He's going to make your fortune. You'll be a poor man no longer, Mr. Popper. Poor, said Mr. Popper. I'm not poor. These birds have been earning us $5,000 a week. Oh, $5,000, said Mr. Klein. What's that? Pin money? I want to put those birds in the movies, Mr. Popper. We've got the story department working on stories for them already. Why, I'll put each of those birds under contract that will keep you and the missus on Easy Street the rest of your lives. Papa, whispered Mrs. Popper, I don't want to live on Easy Street. I want to go back to Proudfoot Avenue. Better consider, Mr. Popper, said the Admiral. I can't offer you anything like that. You say those men at the North Pole get lonely because there are no penguins? Asked Mr. Popper. Very lonely, said the Admiral. But if there were penguins up there, mightn't the polar bears eat them? Oh, ordinary penguins, yes, said the Admiral judiciously, but not such highly trained birds as yours, Mr. Popper. They could outwit any polar bear, I guess. It was now Mr. Klein's turn to speak. In every moving picture house in America, little children would have the pleasure of seeing stories acted by the Popper performing penguins, he said. Of course, if we succeeded in establishing the breed at the North Pole, said the Admiral, the name might have to be changed a little. I imagine that hundreds of years from now, scientists would be calling them the Popper Arctic penguins. Mr. Popper was silent for a moment. Gentlemen, he said, I want to thank you both. I'll give you my decision tomorrow.
Hi everyone, I'm Miss Allison Draney and I teach Excel and Enrichment, and I am here to read to you our final chapter, Chapter 20, Farewell, Mr. Popper. So let's see what it's all about. Chapter 20, Farewell, Mr. Popper. It was a hard decision to make. Long after the visitors had gone, Mr. and Mrs. Popper sat and discussed what was best for everybody. Mrs. Popper could see the advantages of both offers, and she pointed these out without trying to influence him. I feel that the penguins are really your responsibility, she said, and you must make up your mind. It was a pale and haggard Mr. Popper who was ready to announce his decision the next day. Mr. Klein, he said, I want you to know how much I appreciate your offer of putting my birds in the movies, but I am afraid I have to refuse. I do not believe the life in Hollywood would be good for the penguins. Then he turned to Admiral Drake. Admiral Drake, I am going to give you the birds. In doing this, I am considering the birds first of all. I know that they have been comfortable and happy with me. Lately, though, with the excitement and the warm weather, I've been worried about them. The birds have done so much for me that I have to do what is best for them. After all, they belong in a cold climate. And then I can't help being sorry for those men up at the North Pole without any penguins to help them pass the time. Your government will thank you, Mr. Popper, answered the Admiral. Congratulations, Admiral, said Mr. Klein. Maybe you're right at that, Popper. Hollywood might have been too much for the birds. I'd wish you'd let me make one short movie of them here in New York, though, before they go. Just some pictures of the sort of thing they like to do on stage, you know? We'd show the film everywhere with an announcement that these are the famous Popper penguins that are being taken to the North Pole by Admiral Drake of the United States Arctic Penguin Founding Expedition, or something like that. I'd like that very much, said Mr. Popper. We'd pay you, of course, continued Mr. Klein. Not a fortune, as we could have if you'd let us give them a contract, but say $25,000. We could use it, said Mrs. Popper. It will be very quiet at 432 Proudfoot Avenue, said Mr. Popper, when everyone had left. Mrs. Popper did not answer. She knew that nothing she could say could really comfort him. However, said Mr. Popper, now that spring is here, a lot of people will be wanting their houses painted, so we'd better be getting back. Anyway, said Bill, We've had 10 weeks of vacation right in the middle of the year, and not many children in Stillwater can say that. The next day, the cameramen arrived to make the pictures of the penguins doing their tricks. It was arranged that the Poppers should stay in New York just long enough to see the expedition off. Meanwhile, in the harbor, the great sailing ship of Admiral Drake was being made ready for its long trip north. Every day, huge boxes of supplies of all sorts were hustled on board. The most comfortable quarters on the ship were turned over to the penguins, who were the cause of the voyage. Captain Cook was already quite familiar with this ship, since it was the same one the Admiral had sailed to the South Pole, where Captain Cook had often seen it. Greta, too, had seen vessels of its kind. The two of them were kept very busy showing and explaining everything to Nelson, Columbus, Louisa, Jenny, Scott, Magellan, Adelina, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria. The sailors all took the greatest delight in watching the curious little birds at their explorations. It looks as if this will be a pretty lively trip, they would say. These Popper penguins certainly live up to their reputation. But at last, everything was ready, and the day came when the Poppers were to go down and say goodbye. Bill and Janny ran all over the ship and did not want to leave when it was time to draw up the gangplank. The Admiral shook hands with them and Mrs. Popper and thanked them for having helped to train the extraordinary penguins that were to be a real contribution to science. Mr. Popper had gone down below to say a private farewell to his birds. All that kept him from breaking down completely was the knowledge that what he was doing was best for them, too. First, he said goodbye to all the younger penguins, then to Greta, who had saved Captain Cook. Then, last of all, he leaned over and said a special goodbye to Captain Cook, who had come and made life so different for Mr. Popper. Then he wiped his eyes, straightened his back, and went up on deck to say goodbye to Admiral Drake. "Goodbye, Admiral Drake," he said. "Goodbye," repeated the Admiral. "Why, what do you mean? Aren't you coming with us?" "Me? Go with you to the North Pole? Why, of course, Mr. Popper. But how could I go with you? I'm not an explorer or a scientist. I'm only a house painter." "You're the keeper of the penguins, aren't you?" roared the Admiral. "Man alive, aren't those the penguins the reason for this whole expedition? And who's going to see that they're well and happy if you're not going along? Go put on one of those fur suits, like the rest of us. We're pulling anchor in a minute." "Mama!" shouted Mr. Popper to Mrs. Popper, who had already gone up the gangplank. I'm going too. Admiral Drake says he needs me. Mama, do you mind if I don't come home for a year or two?" "Oh, as to that," said Mrs. Popper, "I'll miss you very much, my dear. But we have money to live on for a few years, and in the winter it will be much easier to keep the house tidy without a man sitting around all day. I'll be getting back to Stillwater. Tomorrow is the day for the meeting of the Ladies' Aid and Missionary Society, and I'll be just in time. So goodbye, my love, and good luck." "Goodbye and good luck," echoed the children. And the penguins, hearing their voices, scuttled up on deck and stood there besides the Admiral and Mr. Popper. Then they solemnly lifted their flippers and waved as the great ship moved slowly down the river towards the sea. The end.